So our beloved Nick, who is muted right now, uh,
Now,
has offered to share some insight on dabbing that he thought might be interesting and helpful that goes in further detail than what I described last time. So, Nick, I'm going to give you the floor for
okay,
like 5 minutes.
cool. I'll try to keep it as concise as possible.
Okay, yeah, tell us what you know.
So basically, I didn't attend the class last time, and I watched it on YouTube, and I saw the dab part, and I was like, okay, it's sick. Everything was true. I just wanted to add though that I saw that there was a method shown with just a torch, and the guy has the method where he puts his hand to check how hot it is. And that's cool and all, but there is also other things you can do, like an email. I don't know if anyone knows about that, but since I didn't attend the class, I guess I couldn't see the chat. So I have one here I can show you guys if that's okay. Basically, you have this box here, and then you can set the temperature to the temperature you like. I like 515. I just taste it. It doesn't burn my throat at all. And it's not like a torch dab where it just hits you. And then it goes to this coil that wraps around the banger. And then you drop your product in there, and then you use this, which can control the airflow when you let go, so you can wash it around. So that's another thing that I just wanted to share if no one knows about it. Also, there's if you do the torch dabs, there's temperature readers that you can get that are specifically made for doing dabs, and they're like $250 American, which is like $350 for me. And it essentially does the same thing that a lot of temperature guns do, really good ones, and those are going to be much cheaper, and they'll also have other functions. So I kind of don't like the idea of spending money on that just because it's made for the weed world. They're just going to charge you more. And another thing that I wanted to add was about how BHO products are made, butane hash oil or butane honey oil. It's done with butane, obviously, and there's always a fear that there's butane in the product. I also heard that butane is, even though it's flammable, it's not toxic. So that is something to consider. But there is a new thing that is new in the production of BHO products, and it's something called CRC, and it means color remediation correction, I believe. I'll send a link after in the chat. But this is something that after a BHO product is made, if it's really dark and kind of shitty looking, they can run it through this CRC thing, and it'll take away some of the dirty color, I guess, and kind of clean it up. And it can really make the product look really nice, but it can also be used to make shitty product look good. And it involves the use of silica, which for me is a big concern because silica, I'm pretty sure is carcinogenic. I work in construction, and I've seen videos of it being in concrete, and when you do any jackhammering or whatever, you're supposed to wear a mask. So when I hear the word silica, an alarm goes off. So that's just something I wanted to talk. But obviously, I see now in the chat someone has already mentioned it. So that's just something I wanted to share. And I think that's it.
Sweet. Oh, so nice having people from class submit their own information. That goes for any of you. If you feel like you know a lot about a particular subject and you want to share on it, please feel free to do so. And don't let me forget at the end of class today, I want to tell you guys about our potential guests. I'm going to mute you, Orion. There are two of you. And from there, here we go. Time to get started with DrugsCo and keep talking about weed. I did not turn off all my notifications, so this could get super messy today. I hope we don't have to do that in the middle. Okay, so last time we had just talked about hemp briefly, about how hemp is the cannabis sativa plant, but the hemp portion of things is the non-psychoactive addition, basically. And it's extremely useful for all kinds of applications for making like candles and rope and whatever. So real quick, before I show you a bunch of charts, we're going to go into some like back alley kind of gross cannabis underworld stuff today that we'll touch back on later. I want to get a couple of bits of terminology out of the way real quick so that we're all familiar. So route of administration for weed, obviously smoking is going to be the most well known, but you can also vape it. You can hopefully not like that. You can get an edible form. I know this is like just basic shit. You can, but for those of you that aren't really familiar with weed, you can also get tinctures of weed, which is basically extractions. It's hyper concentrated cannabinoids, whatever you want to call them. If someone has like an industry standard preference that they want to tell me, like I said last time, please go ahead and do so. And then there's also like salves, transdermal administration, which is really useful for people that have like back pain or menstrual cramps or something like that. Salves are becoming more and more popular in dispensaries. There are also vaginal suppositories. Some of you might have heard of the girl that drank a bottle of weed lube and was high for 3 days. There's an amazing article about this that I think includes photos of her just like lying in bed with not just a bag of potato chips on her, but like potato chips on her, and she was like that for days because she was like, oh, this lube isn't really doing much. Like, I guess I'll just drink it because we're not getting high. And she did that. That was the consequence. What a nightmare. Yeah. So just quick terminology. This is a pipe, otherwise known as a piece. This is a dab rig or just a rig, whatever you want to call it. Again, this is for concentrates that you vaporize basically. This is bong, and bong anatomy we'll go into in a second. Again, this is just for like people that have no idea what any of this stuff is. We'll get the baseline out of here. Then you can also use a dab pen. This is a Dr. Dabber, which is a really popular brand for dab pens and like dab rigs and stuff like that, like e-nails, as Nick mentioned. And then there are volcanoes, and volcanoes are kind of like the holy grail of vaping weed. It's like you have it's like $300 for a good volcano, and it involves basically you pop some flour on top of it, it vaporizes it, and it expands this bag so that you can like push your mouth against it, and it gives you a flow of vaporized weed. And then there's a fruit pipe, and I just included this in here for any of you who recall the days of fruit pipes and pieces and bongs very fondly. Yeah, I see you. Um, have any of you ever tried making an eggplant bong? Because I have, and that did not go very well. Ow. Oh, if you heard that crack, that was my shoulder. Um, quick smoking terminology. These are not really words that are typically used. Like, no one's gonna be like, "Hey, can I toke that joint?" And if they do, then like I'm not familiar with that culture, but I'm sure it exists somewhere. Usually it's like, "Can I take a hit? Can I draw that?" Like, "Can I hit that?" is like the most common terminology. And then in terms of weed etiquette, there's cornering, and cornering is a really important thing to know if you're newer to smoking weed or you don't smoke weed very often. If someone hands you a bowl, which is like it's the pipe. The bowl piece is like the bowl shaped piece at the end that you put the weed into. If someone hands you a bowl and they've like got their flour, their nug that's been all like chopped up, and they sprinkle a little keef on top, remember, which contains trichomes. The keef is this kinetic sand that contains a bunch of the cannabinoids. And they've like prepared this nice bowl for you and they pass it to you and they're still green visible, and you just stick your lighter onto it and torch the whole thing, you are not going to be invited back to that smoke sesh. I tell you that now. So cornering is the practice of basically holding the flame just to the edge of the bowl and then inhaling so that you pull the flame down to the corner and you get these nice little burn patches because greens contain the least combusted cannabinoids at the time. I'm looking at banana pipes. Banana was my favorite. Peach was challenging because of the pit. That is so funny. McDonald's Big Mac. I literally do not believe you. Like, I cannot believe I'm saying this out loud, but Pixar didn't happen. How to corner is an art form indeed, yes. So this concept of greens is basically like you want to get the first hit of a bowl that has like fresh weed in it, basically. And it's very polite to corner it and pass it to someone. Puff, puff, pass, again, is not a phrase that's really said out loud, like ever, except in jest, although it might be kind of fun to be like one puff, and then you pass it. The whole idea is that you hit it twice and then you pass it to the next person. Because hitting it once and passing it, it's just not realistic. Like, it's just probably just not going to happen. And then if you have lit the bowl, see, this looks like someone that did not grind their weed very well um, at all and didn't corner it super effectively because it's all lit. This is the cherry. It's like the flame in the bowl. So sometimes if you hit a bowl and you go to pass it to someone else. This is the case of the joint too. A cherry is just a lit ember where if you suck on it, the oxygen will relight that flame and allow you to keep hitting it. So basically, again, this is for if you don't really smoke weed or you've only smoked weed a few times, just know that you don't have to relight it. If there's a little bit of red, you can just hit it again. It's cherried. What is this?
Spliff?
That's a spliff. And I got to keep up with this chat. I frequently have to tell people it's not a microphone if they just ramble on while holding the pipe. Oh my God. Yeah, that's a spliff. Spliff is tobacco and weed together. And this is a big problem on college campuses, actually, is a lot of people smoke spliffs without realizing that tobacco contains nicotine, which is an extremely physiologically dependence-forming and addiction-forming substance, where if you're ingesting it all the time without thinking about it, you could very easily have physical withdrawals and get really irritable and crave spliffs without really knowing why. So please be mindful of smoking spliffs if you're not trying to fuck around with nicotine. Like if you are, then great, that's on you 100%, that's your choice. But if you're not trying to smoke cigarettes on a regular basis, then don't start smoking spliffs, or don't start smoking spliffs regularly or instead of something else. This is a joint. Woo, a J. It's rolled up weed. Really deceptively difficult to roll a nice joint. And then this is a blunt, which is you crack open a cigar, dump out the stuff, or not, you don't have to dump out the tobacco in the cigar, and then you roll weed into it. Yeah. But there's a ton of other stuff that you can do. There are so many different things that you can make to smoke your weed. I remember in high school once, my parents were out of town, and I hosted Build a Bong workshop, which was when I just collected a bunch of garbage from our recycling and had like different sizes of bottles and liter containers all over the table and whatever, and like lug nuts and stuff so people could make bowl pieces. And before anyone even arrived, I was like, okay, I'm gonna try out making a waterfall bong. I think I was 16. I was like maybe 15. I was like, I'm gonna make a waterfall bong. And I made the waterfall bong, which is basically you take a big ass liter bottle and you have the bowl piece at the top, and you poke holes in the sides so the water gets sucked down. You can see like spouts of water coming out, and it fills the entire thing with smoke. And I hit the entire waterfall bong with like very little tolerance at that time, and was so stoned before anyone even showed up at my house that I was just like face down on the floor for the entirety of the party. That's my story about why you should be really careful about smoking homemade smoking devices. And weed is legal in California, so I can tell this story on the internet without any kind of fear. So let's check out a different kind of bong, a gravity bong by Super Deluxe. Basically, you get a big old bottle, get some cutty stuff, cut off the top, cut off the bottom. You have 2 bottles. Fill the bottom one up. Please don't use tin foil. Make a little hole in the top of the thing. That's for your bowl piece. Don't do that. Use something else. Do not smoke out of tin foil. This is bad advice. Bada bing. You put your one bottle into the other bottle. This is like level 50. Don't try doing this if you don't smoke weed like every day. Please. And it's all filled up with smoke. Bam, bam. And then you push the smoke down into your lungs. This person is a champ for taking that huge of a hit. That is just obscene. So that's a gravity bong. And there are a billion different things that you can use, like I said, to make creative bongs and smoking devices, whatever. This is sacrilege to watch. Tinfoil, yikes. Yeah, I know, I'm aware, it's really bad. Tinfoil, I can't tell you exactly why you shouldn't smoke it, to be honest. I would imagine something to do with metal particles, smoking, just not a great combination. Instead, you can use, if you have like a metal ballpoint pen or something, you can unscrew the tip of that, if it's like metal for sure. And you can flip it upside down, pop it in, put some weed in and stick it right there. It's a really small bowl. But other alternatives would probably be like if you have like an actual kit of like a tool kit, you can get like a lug nut or something and then cover the bottom. It's been a while. So quick anatomy of a water bong or a bong. You have the bowl piece, which is where all the weed goes, and then there's a little glass pipe that's called the downstem. You fill water up just past the downstem, and sometimes there are these things called percolators in the middle of them, which are basically just like little filtration chambers that cool the air down. Then there's the carb hole, which you can cover with your fingy. It really depends on the style of bong that you have, and the smoke chamber. So basically, you light the bowl, you like create pressure by pulling in on the bong until the whole bong is filled up with smoke. Then you take out the bowl piece, so there's no resistance when you inhale the whole thing, and you clear the bong. Or you clear part of the bong. Like, don't feel pressured to clear the whole bong. That's a massive hit. Don't do it if you're not down. Generally, if you smoke weed, stereotypical, you get giggly sometimes. You get euphoric sometimes. Sometimes you just get really hungry and you want to go to bed. Sometimes you start thinking that your friends hate you. Sometimes you get super anxious and want to jump out of your skin and spend 4 hours walking around your neighborhood at night. Sometimes you just immediately pass out on the couch and your friends have to wake you up several times before you can get to bed. And sometimes you have a really good drawing and listening to music. Sometimes you have amazing sex. Sometimes you just like have a good time doing absolutely nothing and like twiddling your thumbs. It's a very variable experience. Like, honestly, everyone has a different shit, that's great advice. Everyone has a different experience with weed, and oftentimes it's different every time. Like, it is a very personal substance. As a mechanic, the 9mm socket is the weed socket. The deep socket one is the covert one hitter. I'll say that again. 9mm socket is the weed socket. The deep socket one is the covert one hitter. Thank you for saying socket. That's exactly what I was thinking of. That's what I was thinking of. Okay, big questions now. Can weed cause psychosis? Yes. Oh, the question. And the answer is it's definitely possible. For all of these things, we're in preliminary stages of research somehow still. And part of that is because of regulations. And part of that, honestly, is just because there's so much fucking bias in the industry that it's almost impossible to comb through these articles without using like fine-tooth checking of citations, checking of contributions, checking of like the author backgrounds. There's so much stigma still around weed research, and it's really biased. So it's hard to know, honestly. There's a lot of research that it basically is like, this is conclusive. And then a few years later, someone looks at it and is like, that was not conclusive at all, but people don't know how to read scientific journals. So generally, if you are predisposed to psychosis, smoking THC heavy weed is probably not a good idea for you. But it's interesting because CBD has antipsychotic properties, whereas smoking weed on the whole generally tends to possibly have a positive correlation with psychosis. But there's a catch here, which is that as the industry has evolved, the amount of THC in weed has skyrocketed. Like, we're talking skyrocketed. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's something like a joint in the 60s would be the equivalent of like 5 joints now or something like that. That could be completely wrong, but the point is that the amount of weed has been the amount of THC has been intentionally increased. So it's really difficult to find low potency weed. And generally, if you're smoking weed socially, it's really difficult to not just like keep hitting the joint until you realize that you're way higher than you want it to be. Yeah, we'll watch Reefer Madness tonight, or a little segment of it. So the point here is basically that we don't really fully know the correlation between psychosis and smoking weed, but if you're predisposed personally or from a family perspective, it's probably not a good idea for you to push that envelope too far. And if you decide that you want to smoke weed, you should be really mindful. If you must, I would recommend looking for a CBD heavy strain. What does weed do for anxiety and or depression? And the answer is we don't know, but there's a pretty clear-cut correlation between people having anxiety and or depression, which are often comorbid, they go together, and smoking weed. However, a lot of research tries to spin that as smoking weed causes or worsens these conditions. But what often is the case is that people that already have these conditions happen to smoke weed. And part of this is for symptom control, part of this is just for relaxation, and part of this is that people with mental illness generally gravitate towards substance use as a whole in general. Like, People that have mental illnesses are generally considered to be a marginalized population. There aren't enough resources available. There's a lot of stigma. So this, it makes sense. Like, marginalized demographics are vulnerable in ways that non-marginalized demographics aren't, in different ways for each demographic in particular, right? Regular consumption. Yeah, so a lot of people smoke weed for the purpose of controlling symptoms of mania, for instance, or as like a replacement for other treatments for manic disorders, or I'm sorry, mood disorders or psychotic disorders. The fact of the matter is, if you have a disorder that has manic or psychotic elements to it, then weed might actually make things worse in the long term. So you should be super, super careful if you're deciding to experiment, and really work your way up and be like mindful about that. It could be totally fine, could change your life. It could also have really serious consequences. So always titrate, always go slow. Can you become addicted to weed? Oh, one more thing about this is that weed is very effective at reducing acute symptoms of PTSD. There is no proven efficacy for using weed for PTSD long term, but acutely in the short term, it's shown to be very useful. Can you get addicted to weed? The answer is yes, you totally can. This is something that drives me nuts because people are like, oh, it's just weed. It's not even, it's plant medicine. I got beef with plant medicine, and I'll talk about it later. Serious beef with decrim nature campaigns, to be honest. Yeah, well, I'll talk about the chat in a second. So you can totally withdraw from using weed. That is physical dependence. Now, remember, the difference is physical dependence means that your body has habituated to the presence of a substance. Without the substance, your body doesn't function as normal. Addiction is a behavioral pattern that has roots in all kinds of different shit, but ultimately it's a behavioral pattern that becomes reinforced, which can express in neurological ways. Addiction is super complicated, but the point is that you can have cravings for something and you can have repeated reinforcing behavior about something without withdrawing from it. And you can withdraw from something without having the mental preoccupation with it. Then on the other side of the coin, I know I've repeated this a bunch, it's because everybody forgets. There's psychological dependence, which is not the same as addiction. Psychological dependence is when you are using something to remove a symptom, basically. So for instance, with benzos, you might be using a substance to remove anxiety or panic. And with the removal of a benzo, you might not crave it, but your symptoms might return in fuller force. That's psychological dependence. But it's also like these terms can be used a little interchangeably sometimes. In the case of weed, you can have addictive behaviors and neurological patterns around weed. Like you can around most things, to be honest. And yes, you can totally get physical withdrawals from weed, especially if you've been like a long-term daily user. Irritability, really bad insomnia. Insomnia is the major one. Feelings of like anger or like anhedonia or dysphoria, like you're just not feeling well. That's very common and it's a real thing. Okay, real quick, I have hypomania. I don't think weed would help me at all. Yes, Datura is the only plant medicine I need. Well, Charles, I wish you all the best on that discovery journey. Rattlesnakes are natural too. Weed withdrawals are real. Yeah, they really are. They really are sneaky. So the question about physical health, though, is one that honestly I can't answer. Does weed cause brain damage? The short answer is no. Like in the short term or in moderation, there is no empirical evidence showing that weed causes like significant damage to your brain or to your body. However, chronic heavy users of weed might show memory deficits. It's possible. Um, might show, and this has been shown largely to be reversible as far as we know right now. But again, these studies are super biased, and longitudinal studies that are like spanning across a lot of evidence, often are pulling from biased studies. So it's just so hard to know. And now that the social and political climate around weed is changing, we're going to get some different answers that are possibly skewed in the other direction, that are funded by cannabis magazines and agencies and like research companies. That's the kind of stuff you have to look for. Like the bias of the researcher completely influences the outcome of the research. So I don't know is the answer to this one. I have combed through probably 40 or 50 articles today alone in preparation for this to make sure that I'm up to date on this stuff since last year. And the answer is still not clear. Lung disease, if you're smoking something, combustion hurts. Ouchie. Like, you're probably not going to be doing any major favors to your tissues of your lungs. There is some potential preliminary evidence showing that you might be at higher risk of COPD or pulmonary. Good. Of like asthma exacerbation. If you have something going on respiratory wise, then it's probably not great for you. And during the era of COVID, it's a double-edged sword because you have CBD, which might have immunoprotectant properties, but simultaneously, if you're smoking weed, it probably is not going to do great things for your overall lung health and respiratory health. So basically, if you're gonna do the weed, then I highly recommend looking into alternate methods of consumption. Like, you can vaporize it. That's a great alternative to smoking it. However, it often hits you a lot harder and faster, depending on if you're doing concentrates or just like flower vape. So be very careful about that. Or you can eat edibles. Now, here's a fun little tidbit about edibles. Edibles produce a different high. Yes, I said it. They produce a different high because the actual ratio of chemical molecules in your system is different for edibles than it is for smoking. The reason being that the primary active component of weed, delta 9 THC, delta 9, right? And I'm not going to talk about delta 8. I don't know enough about it to talk about it today, but I'll pick some stuff up and get back to you guys. Delta 9 THC, when you smoke it, it's an oil soluble, it's a fat soluble, oil soluble compound. So when you smoke it, it gets into your bloodstream really, really quickly and immediately is like, I need an endocannabinoid receptor because your blood is mostly water. So that delta 9 THC doesn't really get processed by your liver as much. It doesn't make it to your liver as much as when you eat it. Now, what happens in the liver is that delta 9 THC is metabolized to 11 hydroxy THC, which is a different compound altogether. It's like, it's a metabolite. It's a very unique kind of experience. And that's part of why you get higher for longer and it's often more intense, is because of this slow metabolic processing that produces a more powerful metabolite. So there is a different experience of eating edibles and smoking weed. Some people prefer one to the other, but it is true that you will get higher for longer from edibles, and that is the reason. Smoking daily causes me insomnia. Is there a way to counter the laziness side effect that happens to some consumers? So I remember reading something a year or two ago about this, but I have not been able to find the article since then. So this is just a jumping off point for you all to research about how there was a study done on dopaminergic effects of THC, I believe, or maybe it was just cannabis as the plant as a whole with the mixture of compounds, that said basically that short-term use can enhance dopaminergic signaling. It basically increases functionality in your reward system for the time being. But long-term chronic use has the opposite effect, has a habituating effect on your reward system, which makes stoner laziness real. And like I said, I can't find where that study is. So take that with a packet of salt. Take it with a couple of packets of salt until you can actually find the source of that information. But that could definitely have something to do with it. Also, yeah, honestly, there's not really that much of a way to get around it. Edibles might actually be better for that in tiny quantities. Yeah, you'll have to experiment. Okay, now I just want to share with you guys a scene from a film. How many of you have seen Super Troopers? I want to know exactly how many of you have seen. Wait, hold up your hand if you've seen Super Troopers before. No, so few of you. So few have returned. Okay. Well, here we go. This is a really bad stoner comedy. Like, it's bad. It's low quality. This is not a good film. In fact, I haven't watched it in many years, but I bet that if I watched it now, I would be like, this is trash and actually should probably not be watched. But this opening scene I know is good. So we're going to watch this. So they've just been in the car and they have a big ass bag of weed and a big ass bag of mushrooms. And they're getting pulled over on the freeway and they're smoking a joint and they're like, oh shit, what do we do? So they have this guy in the back seat eat the entire bag of weed and the entire bag of mushrooms in one go. And he's like choking in the back seat. They just gotten pulled over. We haven't been introduced to the main characters of this movie yet, so we don't know what's going to happen.
Is that the same car, man? Do I look high?
Yeah.
Here they come, here they come.
Lick on him, slick it or something. All right.
Be cool.
License and registration.
Officer, I know that...
License and registration, please.
It's too rich.
You know how fast you were going?
What?
How fast you were going.
65.
63.
Officer, isn't the speed limit 65?
Yeah, it is. Where are you boys headed?
Canada. We're going over the border to Canada for some French fries and gravy, sir.
Poutine.
Canada. Almost made it. Are you okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, sir?
Yes, sir.
No, did you say yes, sir?
I think he said, yeah, sure. What'd you say, man?
Well, I said, yeah, sure. But literally what I said was, yeah, sure, sir.
So you are okay then?
Yes, sir.
You smell something, Rabbit?
Fear.
Now hand over that registration.
Yes, sir. My mother's gonna kill me. Look, don't mind. I don't get it, man. What fucked up is fucked up, man. This shit is fucking crazy.
Shit, man. I was just about to pull out my 9 and put a cap in that pig's ass.
Oh my God.
It's a real bummer that doesn't include the part where the kid in the backseat starts tripping and the guy's like, are you okay? And he goes, candy bars. Anyway, and that's just your brief obligatory glimpse into stoner culture. And then there's How High. Have any of you seen How High? Hang on. Oh my God. I want a free stay at Marriott hotels. God, they're so nice to me. They offer me this free hotel room like 5 times a day. It's so sweet. Okay, so real quick, evolution of the stoner comedy, right? This is like just obligatory. The Big Lebowski, I'm sure many of you are intimately familiar with. Dazed and Confused, Up in Smoke, Harold and Kumar, Pineapple Express, Super Troopers, of course. But this all started with Reefer Madness, which is arguably the original stoner comedy. Am I right? Now it actually is kind of watched as a stoner comedy, as people are like, this is really, really whack. ACAB. So just a quick history shebang about weed. It's been around forever, literally thousands of years. This tomb was discovered where someone was buried, I believe in China, with a bowl of weed next to them. Like, this is a revered plant in many, many cultures. And real quick, I want to do like a brief global dive into this with this.
Over 12,000 years ago, a revolution began to spread throughout the world. Humankind began to transition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to one of settlement, thanks to agriculture, the emerging practice of farming. Indigenous to Central Asia, cannabis is believed to have existed in the region since the pre-Neolithic period. The Chinese people first cultivated cannabis as early as 4000 BCE, referred to as ma, the fibers of the plant stalk known as hemp, the non-psychoactive form of cannabis, were beaten off by hand to create paper and cloth. Around this time, stories of a mythical Chinese emperor named Shen Nung began to surface. These portray him as an early proponent of cultivating cannabis for both paper and cloth, and as a champion of cannabis for medicinal and recreational purposes. As the stories go, Shen Nung was a herbalist whose findings were reportedly documented in The Great Herbal, an ancient guide that has since been rewritten and updated and is still in use by practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine today. The Great Herbal stated that cannabis is good for the 5 organs, as well as bringing the body into yin-yang balance. The text also stated that cannabis was good for your skin, stomach, hair, and energy, and that it could help you let go. And if consumed long enough, could teach people how to talk to the gods. And much like how cannabis is wind-pollinated, its usage wafted westward across the different regions and cultures of the ancient world. In India, cannabis was mentioned in the Vedas, the oldest scriptures of Hinduism. There, cannabis would later be referred to as the food of the gods. Ground into paste with a mortar and pestle, it was given an edible preparation.
Hey.
And allegedly, a holy man did eat cannabis.
Sure.
It said that Buddha ate a single seed daily for 6 years.
Oh, Mellow. What the fuck? That's
From India to the Middle East and on to Africa, cannabis continued its spread. Passed from Indian Hindu travelers to mystic Sufi travelers. As European commerce and conquest intersected with the Middle East and India, cannabis traveled to new continents, specifically to the Western Hemisphere, courtesy of the Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, British, and French, who made it a necessity for their empires back home in Europe. The rise of hemp increased both the design and quality of ships' ropes and sails. This enabled boats to sail further. Over 12,000 years ago, colonies, the continent became home to new... As the New World became home to new colonies, the continent became home to new industries, enforced by royal demands and growing empire. In the 17th century, Jean Talon, the representative of King Louis XIV in Quebec, confiscated thread to encourage inhabitants to grow hemp. And in the British colonies, King James made hemp cultivation mandatory for ship sails to ensure British supremacy on the high seas. Cultivation wasn't just for the maritime age. It was for the modern medicinal age, too. That same century, Louis Hébert, apothecary to Samuel de Champlain, planted the first known cannabis plant in Canada in 1606. While the Greeks had long thrown cannabis onto hot coals and spas to relax, Dr. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy was the first European to throw cannabis into rigorous medical testing during the 19th century. He found it had great value as a sedative and anticonvulsant, relieving the pain of rheumatism, stopping convulsions, and quelling muscle spasms. Validating Indian folk uses of cannabis through a medical lens, O'Shaughnessy popularized cannabis's therapeutic uses in medical papers. O'Shaughnessy's papers created buzz, starting a trend of turning pot into patent medicines, the precursor to over-the-counter medicine. By the early 20th century, 2,000 different cannabis medicines were being produced by close to 300 manufacturers in the West. Unregulated patent medicines, some of which were dangerous, were advertised with unsubstantiated and often fraudulent claims about their efficacy. This caught the ire of American authorities, who implemented the Pure Food and Drug Act at the start of the 20th century, an action believed to set cannabis on the course to...
Okay, so I have a couple of problems with this video. The first is that it's a super whitewashed version of this history. The second is, yeah, Charles, as you said, no comment about Afghanistan and the Middle East, which is like this. But the third is that this was, I think, a really beautiful video, which is why I like it so much. I think it's a very like nice visual description of how this cultural shift took place, but it also totally neglects the fact that South America was growing weed too. Like, the problem with the history of weed is that if you really wanted to look at where it was globally during this time, you'd have to look like everywhere except Russia, probably. But like so many different countries and regions were growing weed and using it for different purposes. Yeah, in India, there's bong. I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Bong. Shit. Bhang. And it's a drink that is weed infused, very bitter apparently. Kush Mountain check. So what I really want to look at though is weed in America in the early 20th century, and this is like one of the most despicable acts of historical legislation and one of the most racist pieces of legislation ever enacted. And the history behind it is pretty terrible. This guy, Harry fucking Anslinger, his name is actually just Harry Anslinger. His middle name is probably something different. He was the head of the Department of Prohibition for Alcohol in the 10s, when the Volstead Act was in place. It was prohibition against alcohol. And we're going to look at what that looked like in actuality. I don't know if you guys know this, but I think around 10,000 Americans died because the US government intentionally poisoned alcohol making supplies during prohibition. Yep, this has been going on forever. But why did prohibition end? Because white people wanted their booze back. So Harry Anslinger was going to lose his job, basically, is what it comes down to. The DEA didn't exist yet. The FDA, I think, was just in the works at this point in time. And he was quoted as saying, "There is no more absurd fallacy than the idea that cannabis is dangerous." Now, pay attention to him saying, did I leave a quote? Oh, no, I didn't. Pay attention to the word cannabis here. This is important. He calls it cannabis. Fuck you, Harry Anslinger. Now, 1910 to 1920, the Mexican Revolution was happening, and there were, I think, around 800,000 legal immigrants from Mexico to the United States, legal immigrants. And Mexican immigrants brought the practice of actually smoking weed, which had been in the United States without incident at all up until that point in time, had been used medicinally, was being explored for other practices and purposes. You saw there were tons of medications that were based off of it. And of course, we are in America, and the immediate response to this influx of legal Mexican immigrants was basically a public health crisis that was manufactured. The idea was that people didn't want immigrants coming in, the Great Depression was brewing, and what better way to conflate these things by xenophobia and being like, well, obviously this like devil's plant is marijuana. Like, this is not cannabis anymore, it's marijuana. And it was said with like that exaggerated pronunciation, specifically to emphasize the otherness of those who smoked it. And this is possibly actually before this, even Chinese opium dens in the late 1800s, same deal, xenophobia in Northern California and the railroads with Chinese immigrants, like extraordinary bigotry faced by Chinese immigrants. And then we'll also look at the cocaine fields, where cocaine was intentionally supplied to Black laborers and then later demonized because productivity got too high. And the same pattern is repeated, but this is possibly the most like directly visible in legislature, this thing happening. There is no mistake here. This is no hypothesis. This is like point A to point B. Harry Anslinger made the connection. Mexican people are dirty. They smoke weed. Let's call it marijuana. Also, I'm going to lose my job. And this was how the transition from prohibition of alcohol to prohibition of marijuana was seamless with the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind, as well as some other tidbits, which I will not read out loud. So take a second. This is the basis for prohibition of weed in this country. This right here. This was what started all of it. Now, immediately following this. 1936, 1 year before the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, Reefer Madness was released.
Boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. The burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
If you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
It's like really hard to believe that that's like an actual full feature-length film that was released. Like dead ass, that was released. So after that point, this became a rallying cry. This became a rallying cry of racism and anti-immigrant ideologies. Was we don't want marijuana in the country. Up until the 60s, there were extremely harsh laws for possessing weed within states. And every year they got worse and worse and worse until the 50s rolled around. And suddenly your white suburban kids were interested in smoking weed. And almost immediately, with these white kids at risk of being arrested, state laws were loosened up. Federal laws remained the same, but state laws started changing. Specifically in response to this trend, started changing as a means of accommodating, very literally. Now, in 1972, Richard Nixon hired the Schaefer Commission, which was basically this panel of people that he expected to back up his claim that marijuana was an extremely dangerous drug that should be outlawed immediately. But this backfired with pretty extraordinary flying colors, basically saying, we actually don't see any risk here and you should decriminalize it completely. And he immediately disbanded the Schaefer Commission and hushed it up like nothing had happened. This is a real thing that did indeed happen. The article is linked in this slide if you're curious. Now, right now, the map. Let's take a look at, this is a really useful website if you're curious about weed in your state right now because the laws are changing. This was updated this month. DISA.com/map of marijuana legality by state. And it's great because you can see where it's legal versus decriminalized for medical or recreational purposes. And there's more information down here. And you can look at the original state or the actual state laws. So if this is something that might benefit you, then check this out. It's on the slide. And now I want to point out something very, very interesting. Is anyone familiar with this patent already? Say so in the chat if you are. A weed patent. No one is familiar with it. Interesting. Okay, let's look at this. This is a patent for cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants, filed by the United States of America in 2003. The United States government, specifically the Department of Health and Human Services, patented the medical use of cannabinoids in 2003. Now, that's a bit weird, isn't it? Isn't cannabis Schedule 1 indicating that its components have no accepted medical value? So how did they get away with this? And why did they do this? There was obviously knowledge that cannabis and its components, 113, 120, I think actually cannabinoids contained within it. Now, this actually might be out of date at this point. I could not find an update to figure it out, but I don't think it is out of date. In response to that patent, specifically that patent, the United States government could grant an organization exclusive rights to research the potential outcomes of that patent. And I think in 2015, maybe 2017, they granted it to Canalife. Now, this one company is now able to perform research on this patent, and patenting is a whole sticky subject that we're going to look into later. It is really a mess. But this opens a lot of questions, right? About Idaho is trying to ban future legalization legislation. LOL. This opens a lot of questions about whether the United States government can patent potential applications of substances that are like literally derived from strains, because this could mean that this sets up a really easy way for the US government to start kind of like striking deals with major organizations that could then exploit their understanding of how to mix strains, etc., and produce their own unique proprietary blends that can't be used by anyone else. This is all speculation. There's no indicator right now that the US government is going to collab with Monsanto, except, does anyone know who makes the pesticides that are used to spray coca crops in South America? Monsanto. The US government contracts Monsanto for their pesticides. So in effect, this is very literally like a big handshake corporation thing that's happening right now with like the mixture of politics and drugs and income. It's all completely interrelated. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Now, because of this is like an interesting side effect of this happening. Now that we've had an increase in availability of weed in the United States, the boom, we're seeing that cartels have been switching their focus, because even when there is, I don't know what I was going to say, something about supply and demand, but the point is that there's lots of demand for drugs. And now that there's a legal market for weed, which was really probably the most lucrative and easiest to grow comparatively, growers are switching to poppy. Like, it just makes sense. And this basically shows why incrementalism won't work. If you remove the illicit market for one thing that's being produced, like the need is being filled by people that are trying to get by, basically, then they'll switch to something else that needs to be made. Like, you're not going to just like get rid of the illicit market by legalizing certain substances and not others. And I can stay after and elaborate on my feelings on this, but this is why it is all or nothing, baby. It is so much easier to say, let's decrim all drugs, than it is to say, let's decrim only heroin and meth and cocaine and PCP, because those are the ones that are left over. Like, imagine how many years that would take. You can't really do that. Oh, we're going to run out of time. Now, this is opening a can of worms that we're going to come back to in much greater detail later, but the start of talking about incarceration. And this is, this rabbit hole goes so deep, y'all, like so deep. We start with this concept of private prisons, which we'll come back to. Private prisons have a contract with law enforcement officers and the government, basically, or with the government specifically, saying for the vast majority of them, we need to always be 90 to 100% full at all times. This is in contract with private prisons and the government, which means that if they're not 100% full, taxpayers foot the bill, paying for whoever would have occupied those cells. There is incentive to arrest, not to mention prison labor, which we'll come back to in a little bit. Drug possession is by far and away the easiest thing to arrest someone for. Arresting by the numbers is canon in American law enforcement and culture, but then there's also this thing called asset forfeiture, which some of you might not be familiar with. And asset forfeiture is basically saying you can seize something that you suspect to have been in relation to a crime. Now, obviously, most of asset forfeitures are going to be around substances, and most of those are going to be around weed, because it's slim pickings, basically. You can say, oh, this car that you were using to transport, that's ours now. But the worst part is that you don't even need to be charged or convicted for them to keep your property. And yes, this is a real thing that happens right now. if you are involved or suspected to be involved in something that is drug related or crime related, they can literally just take your stuff and auction it and they can keep the profits. Or it's basically like you auction it or you do like a trade of goods, and then the profits are split between the government and the law enforcement office that was responsible for this forfeiture. There is perverse incentive. There is fucked up incentive for law enforcement to perpetuate this cycle of civil asset forfeiture. Yes. And, you know, this isn't a direct tie to private prisons and minimum occupancies because the prison industrial complex is a much bigger beast than this that involves so much more than just this. But know that asset forfeiture exists and it is benefited by this. Now, as of 2018, 4 in 10 drug arrests, 40% of drug arrests were made for possession, sale, or manufacture of weed specifically. 40%. Now, most of our arrests in the country are made for weed, or not weed, are made for drugs. And most of those arrests are made for possession. Like the vast, vast majority of incarceration around drugs is nonviolent and for possession. We'll look more into this when we do our incarceration unit. But like this is low-hanging fruit of the country. But then it gets more, then it gets more specific, right? Like this isn't just an issue of money grabbing. This is an issue of racist policing. It has always been a racist policing. When people say the system is broken, the system is functioning as it was built to function. We cannot continue functioning on a constitution that was built by cishet white men in hundreds of years ago. I say, covering up the fact that I forgot for a second what century the Constitution was written in. But regardless, it's fucking out of date. You know what I mean? Like, update that software, please. It's really, really overdue. So this was 2001, 2010. This is the arrest rate comparison of Black Americans versus white Americans around weed in, I think, Virginia. I think this was the state of Virginia. This is blatant, factual racism on paper. It shouldn't take this being on paper for it to be understood, but it does. So here it is. Broken down by county. Cook, Illinois is Chicago. Now, again, we're going to get way, way, way further into this later. And we're just about to be out of time. But yeah, this is right here, like one of the biggest topics that we're going to talk about in this course. The rate of use of weed by Black Americans versus white Americans is about the same. No joke. Almost identical. In fact, the rate of sale of weed is thought to be higher by white Americans. But this is what we're looking at. Food for thought for next time. We're going to go into much greater detail. I'm going to stick around for, oh, that's right. What I was going to say at the start was about guest speakers. A friend of mine is an underground happy hardcore DJ in Los Angeles who is like the king of rave. So if any of you are particularly interested in learning about underground rave culture, specifically in the realm of like obscure electronic music that migrated from Europe and has become like massively intertwined, Orion, you know, it's Flapjack. Then you might be really into this because he's like a character and a half. If I pick a date for this, I will send out more information. But also, if you consider yourself to be like an expert in a particular field pertaining to substances, or you know someone that is, feel free to refer them to me. I want to schedule our first roundtable discussion coming up soon, which is going to be on decrim nature and incrementalism. So you can also feel free to send me an email if there's something in particular you think we should do a roundtable on, like a specific discussion about, but I will send out a poll sometime in the next like 8 months with more questions that you can fill out. Basically, as soon as I get my shit together, I will send out a poll to ask you guys what you would most like to see. This could include possibly like a meeting with the founder of DanceSafe, for instance, to talk about the different trends in ecstasy since 1998 and prior to that, or other kind of like similar things that might be a little bit sneaky. 8 more months of class. Other than that, I'm going to stop recording now and I'll stick around for questions. And if not, then have a great night.